Hello, you're listening to Queer Everything, a queer of color podcast about thriving in the world while being at odds with it. I'm Lena Rafiq Sheikh. I'm excited today to share my conversation with Lamya H, the author of Hijab Butch Blues. For those of you who don't know, the book came out earlier this year. Lamya is South Asian and grew up in a wealthy Arab Gulf state, like me. The book is a series of memoir essays drawn from their life, told alongside beautifully personal, queer readings of stories of the prophets from the Quran. It was actually Nima Avashia, whom I spoke with in the very first episode ever of this podcast, who let me know about the book. I was fascinated. My exact words were, "This blurb reads like my trajectory. It's nice to see a queer South Asian writer who grew up in the Middle East and came to the US for college and was a young adult in New York." I don't often get to speak with queer people from my part of the world who know intimately the complexity of growing up in the Middle East and who came from a home like mine. It's an extraordinarily difficult experience to communicate. Usually I don't bother. I could never have imagined there being a book out about it. Aside from this, the essays are phenomenal. Lamya explores themes like coming to an understanding of themselves as queer and telling other people, of journeying home for Eid with a partner, of self-acceptance, all through her retellings of Quranic stories of the prophets, starting with how the story of Maryam helped her come to an awareness of her own queerness. I reread the book as I was editing the episode and was struck by one essay in particular. The retelling of the story of the prophet Yusuf, who was sold into slavery in Egypt and saved the country with his prophetic dream about a coming famine, as a parable for queer indispensability. The essay is just phenomenal. If you haven't read the book, I highly recommend you do. Welcome. Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to have Lamya H with me today. Lamya H is the author of Hijab Butch Blues, a series of memoir essays that explore their journey with queerness, with growing up in rich Arab country and coming to the United States as a young adult. This book was really powerful and revelatory for me to read for a number of reasons. If you've listened to other episodes, you know that I grew up in the same region of the world and share similar elements of cultural background. Lamya, I'm really excited to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Lena.
So the first question is always for people who are not familiar with your work, what would you like them to know about you?
I'm queer, I'm Muslim, I'm non-binary, and I have been writing for a number of years. Hijab Butch Blues is my first book. It's a book in which I tell stories from my queer brown immigrant life alongside stories from the Quran and just like really reimagining the prophets and figures in the Quran and telling their stories as queer brown immigrant narratives as well. I live in New York, the best city in the world. Yeah, those are my things.
Wonderful. So Hijab Butch Blues, this is your debut work of this length, is that correct?
Yeah, I had written essays before, but never a full-length book. I actually didn't think I could write this because writing essays is such a different experience. They're so sort of short and tightly contained, and you start with an argument that you want to make. And so for a really long time, I didn't think that I could write something that was longer and that moved through time and space. But I feel really excited and, grateful to have this book out there in the world.
Mm-hmm. So I've spoken to a couple of authors on this podcast in the last year and a half, and it's really exciting to me to have work by people from our part of the world. And especially when somebody mentioned this to me, I was like, really? Somebody who grew up in the Khalij and is desi of background, and queer, right? That's key. I was like, that's really exciting that we're at a point where there is a book by a person like that. I'm curious about what motivated you to write it. How did you get to a place where you decided to put together a collection of essays and put it out there like this?
What did you grow up reading? I'm curious because when I was growing up, I read only books
Yeah.
by white people,
Yeah.
about white people. And like,
Yes.
I don't know if you read Enid Blyton. Did you read Enid Blyton, Lena?
Oh God, yeah. Oof.
So racist,
Yeah.
so like, oh my God, so much white supremacy.
Yes.
Yeah, I
Yes.
definitely didn't grow up reading books about people of color, about queer people. And so, yeah, I find it really exciting too that like it's not just my book that's out there in the world, but also it seems like there's so many other queer Muslim books, YA books, adult books, fiction, nonfiction. It seems like a really exciting time to be a reader who's interested in queer Muslim things. I just find that so cool.
Mm.
The way that my book came about was that I wrote a lot of essays, and I found myself writing this one essay / chapter of my book that comes towards the end. It's a chapter called Hajar. And it's basically the story of Ibrahim and Eid, but told through Hajar, who is always spoken about in these stories, but is just like relegated to a side character, which blows my mind because to me, she's such a big part of the narrative, not just moving the narrative forward, but also just like being like enmeshed and like figure who is actively participating in this story. And it was Eid. And, you know, I was hearing the story of Ibrahim over and over and just like really wondering about Hajar and why her story doesn't get told. And at the same time, I was taking my partner to Eid at my family's and having this experience where we were both pretending to be friends so that my partner could meet my family. And I was thinking a lot about my partner's sacrifices, my sacrifices, and Hajar's sacrifices. And so this essay just came about. And once I wrote it, I just found myself surprised at how many other similar essays I wanted to write. And in some ways, I had been writing as I lived them. I, you know, had always thought of the prophets and all of these other figures in the Quran as like these complicated, messy characters who, you know, have internal narratives of their own and who make some decisions that make sense to me and then make some decisions that I really just don't understand or don't agree with. And so I had always found myself sort of like thinking about these figures alongside stories from my own life. So after I wrote the Hajar essay, to me, it felt like a lot of the other essays wrote themselves in some ways. And I was able to write these chapters and then really think through telling a bigger story about myself. And yeah, and I found that the experience was really scary. I'm not a writer by training. I just can't even imagine what it would have been like as a kid to go up to my parents and be like, I want to be a writer. So of course I did a very, very practical degree instead. And yeah, so writing has sort of become my like side thing, but it's something that I'm finding to be really meaningful and enriching.
Fantastic. Yeah, I thought you did a really beautiful job with lacing your interpretation of these stories that you grew up with and that you have really deep and profound and compassionate and loving connection with the things that were going on in your life. I was really struck by that. Going back to, well, let's see. I was struck by the story about how you encountered the story of Miriam when you were young and in school, in your teens, in, I believe it was Quran class, and how that really gave you a window, an opening into your queerness. Would you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. You know, I think it's so interesting because I went to this very orthodox Islamic school, and interestingly, we read these stories in the Quran and we sort of like read various translations. And we were never taught to like not ask questions. And we were never taught to, I guess, take interpretations for what they're worth. So I remember reading the story of Maryam in Quran class and just being so blown away at two things. The first thing is that, you know, when Maryam is in labor giving birth to Isa, aka Jesus, she sort of like yells at God and like screams at them and it's just like full of rage and it's just like, I wish I had died before this. And I remember being 14 and like reading this and just like having my mind blown. Like A, that someone could talk to God like this, and then B, that, you know, someone could express that they want to die. It's just been something that I had never heard anyone say aloud before. And so that really, really blew my mind and made me feel so connected to Maryam. And then the other thing that I just like found myself coming back to over and over was this idea that when an angel comes to Maryam, and, you know, at this point, she's living in a temple and doesn't have anyone really around her. No one is sort of monitoring what she does. This angel comes to her and says, hey, I have something to tell you. And then immediately Maryam is like, no, thank you, please leave. And this angel is supposed to be, you know, handsome and beautiful. And just to me, it blew my mind so much that she said no. And it mirrored so much of my feelings towards men. And there's, you know, I obviously write about this in the book, but there's this moment at which I found myself putting my hand up in class and asking my teacher, wait, did Maryam not like men? And I don't know, it just like felt like this moment of connection and felt like this moment of feeling really seen and validated by the story in the Quran. And it's just like stayed with me ever since. This idea that these figures and prophets and various people that we hear in these almost saintly ways were actually just like people, and they were flawed and beautiful and messy and human, and they were just like us. And maybe some of them were queer, and maybe some of them were sort of angry at God, and some of them wanted to die. And I don't know, the points of connection to me made them feel so human and made me have so much empathy for them. And in some ways, it's like, it's something that's allowed me to have empathy for myself. So yeah, it's something I think about a lot.
I think it's really beautiful how you felt through and really interpreted the stories. And there was so much compassion and so much connection, the figures in the story. And there was so much connection with them. There's something that I found really, it's both bold and also really claiming a relationship with them. Because, I mean, probably have many people in both of our orbits who choose to leave the religion, right, over the identity question.
Definitely.
Yeah. In my case, even if I was straight, I don't think I would have been a particularly observant person, right? Just me being the way that I am. And I really love how this was a claiming of your own connection and relationship with it, with the stories and with the faith. Would you call it a queering of, or a queer reading of the stories?
I think that's a really good question. I think in some ways, if we're talking about queer as sort of like expansive and anti-hegemonic, I think like there are a lot of interpretations that are queer readings of the Quran, not just mine, like even like ones that you would see as very traditional ones. And I'm off the camp that every interpretation is a personal one. Even, you know, the scholars who spend decades, you know, really capturing the nuances of grammar and looking at the various texts around the Quran. I think every interpretation, every translation is an interpretation, and every interpretation is personal. And I actually think that's a really beautiful thing. And I don't know, I think that that's where some of the power of text comes from in general, is having a personal connection to it. And I find it so strange that people are so afraid of that somehow having a personal interpretation of something like the Quran is like such a thing to be feared. But maybe it's a thing to be feared because it's so queer and because it appends more sort of like rigid readings that don't really serve anyone.
Absolutely. You know, when you asked me earlier about whether I had read Enid Blyton, it reminded me of something that actually made me laugh out loud in your book. The part where you were talking about your parents' embarrassing affinity for British culture.
Yours too?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So there were things like that. There was that. There was the encounter that you had with those Lebanese kids and all sorts of other details about life in that part of the world that just struck me and bowled me over. Because again, I don't see that very often represented or talked about. It's sometimes very hard to communicate where I grew up and how I grew up. It's a long story. It's a paragraph at least.
Yeah.
So I love that you made the choice to write about that. And I'm curious what the process of writing about it was like. Did you see it differently in going back to it? What was it like?
I think it's so interesting. I don't know if you found this to be the case, but I sometimes find that so many people who grew up in the Gulf have these idealized, nostalgic, like remembrances of their childhood. And I just like find that so fascinating because that's not how I remember it at all. And interestingly, I wonder if these people were just like totally blind to how everyone outside of them was treated just in terms of race and class. And yeah, I don't know. Have you found this to be the case? I'm curious.
It depends. I think for people who go back, that's one thing. And for people who can't go back, because I think there's many people who were just there because their folks were on a contract and now they're letting tourists into the kingdom. Now they're apparently letting gay tourists into the kingdom. I don't know if you saw that piece of news, which I'm very skeptical about. So for me, Saudi being like the more restrictive of, the Gulf countries, the people who I grew up with or who I know grew up there, they tend to have that maybe if they spent their childhoods there, less so if they were teenagers or young adults, right? And I can see why the nostalgia is there. I mean, I grew up in an extremely safe environment because it was essentially a gated housing estate, right? We could run around. It was the 80s, so internet and video games hadn't really taken off yet. We could run around from all day, even at night, and parents would know that we're fine, right? The stupid shit we got into aside. And so I see it from that perspective. I do. And then for people who I think were there during their teenage years or who weren't at the international schools, I think that they probably saw a different side of it. That's my sense.
Yeah, no, I can totally see that. I find it so, I find it so interesting when I do encounter this that I knew that when I wanted to write about my childhood, I really wanted to highlight the way that race and class operated. And it's interesting because even thinking back, because I was way younger and didn't quite have the politics that I do now, I actually find it really hard to figure out the ways in which race and class moved. And so I have to like really think, and it obviously looks very different from what it looks like in the US. And so I found that when I was thinking about my childhood and thinking about how to write about this place that I grew up, I had to like really dig deep and ask questions and read up on things and like really dig back into how I was feeling. And just because I couldn't name something as racist, for example, doesn't mean that like I couldn't like feel the friction and the tension. And then I had to like really think back about what about it felt hard and what about it was fucked up.
I have to say that reading about that, what you were talking about, all the stuff about race and class and social hierarchy that met in that story you told about the two Lebanese kids, it made me think back to when I was a young kid on the compound, how I was excluded from this group of kids. And ostensibly, I thought it was because I was friends with this one boy who everybody thought was like gross, right? And when I read your essay, I was like, oh, wait a minute. As soon as I think about who these kids were, who were giving me a hard time, they were all Levant Arab kids, every single one. And I was like, okay, that is probably what was more likely going on, because that other reason, I think that was my 5-year-old mind reasoning,
Yeah. And then the other layer of this that I find myself thinking back to is also the way in which Islam got superimposed on that. Like I think a lot about the ways in which people would straight up tell me to my face that if you don't understand if you don't speak Arabic, you're sort of like inauthentically Muslim, which is just like, wait, what? Like,
what?
Yeah, or that absolute favorite was when I was, I think in like second or third grade, someone told my mom that my mom wore kurta shalwar, and someone told her that what she was wearing was like not Islamic because she's wearing pants. And yeah, I think about those racist, classist comments a lot too, and the way in which Arabness and this idea of like hierarchies and discrimination and marginalization, like how all of those things work in a decidedly un-American, un-Western context. Yeah, so I find myself thinking about those a lot too.
Absolutely. Yeah, the power arrangements over there are very different. The language doesn't always transpose, and that can be a hard thing to explain. So presumably your journey was like mine. I left the Middle East, came to the US for college, and then for various reasons decided to stay. There was also a lot of themes in your book that are universally queer, like the part about having situationships with straight girls.
Oh, yeah.
And the journey around that. I read that and I was like, half my face was like under a blanket because it's so real. And I appreciate you sharing about that, about your own journey. And yeah, I'm curious about what writing about that was like for you.
Yeah. It's really funny because this was definitely like a big sort of phase in my life. And it wasn't until I was writing it that I was like, oh my God, I have so many awful stories. Why do I have so many stories about straight girls? Yeah, it's definitely like something I know it's an experience that a lot of people have. But interestingly, I think for me, it's just like something that I had to like really move through. I had to like really interrogate where that was coming from, like what purpose was it serving to be, in these situationships with straight girls, and what was I afraid of, and what was stopping me from going on dates with queer women. Yeah, and interestingly, I think that I don't know, I really had to do a lot of like really deep soul searching to come out of it. And now I can look back on it and roll my eyes and be like, oh my God, what was I thinking? Oh my God, I can't believe she did X, Y, and Z. But at that time, it was really intense.
It took me right back to when I was 27. And I remember having this point in my life where I was like, oh, thank God that's not happening anymore. Right? It was, yeah.
Can I tell you something that I didn't end up writing about in my book? I had one of my sort of like straight girl situationships ended up dating my roommate who was a dude. And that was awkward.
I'll bet. Yeah. Awkward in like a torturous way or awkward just in an awkward way?
Awkward in like every single way.
Yeah. Yeah. Oof. Yeah. I hear that. I mean, this situation from when I was 27 is not dissimilar. Like it was, yeah.
Wow, we've had a lot of parallels.
Yeah. I think after that one, I, as you said, did some soul searching and finally was like, okay, what is this doing? As you said.
Yeah, for me, it was like on some level, it was sort of like cognitive, and it was definitely like I found myself doing some soul searching, but also I think it was just so helpful to have people around me, like my queer life mentor and like friends who like really held me accountable. I think there's something about queer friendship that is just so beautiful in that way and is so direct and is just like, I see through you and I'm watching you and I know what you're doing. And just like having that accountability and just having people be like, are you sure this is what you want? Just really, really shifted things for me.
So I have a curiosity about that because I spent my 20s in New York. And in some ways, I think, we have a lot of parallels. And then in some ways, and I have a theory, there are also divergences, right? I spent a long time purposely not seeking out Muslim spaces or even Desi spaces. And that was because of all of the stuff that I'd internalized in those spaces. And I didn't see any possibility for queerness or freedom in them. Right. Even though I lived in New York, where I know there was a thriving scene, I think there was still some defensive posturing on my part. which only changed, as I mentioned, when a certain mutual of ours came into my life and opened my eyes to these things. Hi, by the way, if you're listening. And
Hi.
and then the other thing is that I spent a lot of time in queer spaces and not having the political consciousness that I do now. I didn't understand why I found those spaces to feel off as well, right? I think I also personalized that. So here's about two things. One is, how is it that you came to connect with those spaces, and what was being in queer space sort of more generally like for you?
The way that I came to find queer Muslim community was, honestly, I found myself on a lot of listservs. I was always like looking to go to things in the city, like events, art shows, or plays, readings, etc. And on one of these, Coming Out Muslim play was advertised. Have you heard of it? Have you seen this?
I have not. No.
It's so incredibly beautiful. And it's put on by these two people, Wazina and Taina, who have just like really like just put a lot of their sort of like vulnerabilities and their life stories into this work. And so there was this play, and, I went to go see it. And at their second showing or something, they had advertised that there was going to be a queer Muslim mixer. And at first I was just so nervous, just because like all of the things that could potentially go wrong could go wrong. I was like, you know what? Like, my cousin is going to be there and I'm going to freak out. My cousin is just going to be there, like coming out of the bathroom or something, and she's going to see me going into this and my whole world will fall apart. Or I was like, someone will just not realize that I'm queer and will ask invasive questions or something. But I, was brave and went and just found myself really, really connecting with folks. And at that point, I was just so hungry for friends. I had lived in the city a few years at that point, but I was just like really hungry for people that felt like my people, because I had, tried to make friends by going to a lot of straight Muslim spaces. I had gone to various Islamic centers and various halakas and like just like things. And while some of those were really lovely, it just like, it felt like something was missing, and my ability to connect with people just wasn't quite what I wanted it to be, because I was just like holding so much of myself apart from so many of the people there. And then I played for a sports team, and that was very queer. And so had a lot of access to white queer spaces as well. And same thing, it just felt like people just didn't get me at some level.
Right. So
yeah, I was just so hungry for community. I was so hungry to find other people who were living their lives as people who were queer and Muslim or Muslimish, and just like being people in the world that when I found the space, I friend chased everyone so hard. I really like just unashamedly like got everyone's numbers, texted people, and just like wormed my way in. And yeah, just like finding that community like just really profoundly changed my life, from like beautiful queer friendships to chosen family, and just being around other people who were broken open in the same way just felt so life-giving. And it really like taught me how to live, and taught me how to really let go some of my own rigidities and my own issues and flaws, I guess. Yeah, just really, I think, made me a much better person and friend.
That's fantastic. So how old were you when you connected with that community?
I think I was in my mid-20s, I would say.
Yeah. That's really profound. Because I remember spending time in queer spaces and feeling like something was just out of step. And it didn't occur to me now until I was in my mid-30s why that was. And there was two experiences that led me to that. One of which was, if you can believe it, ending up at a queer night in one of the Emirati cities.
Oh, wow.
So I had gotten off the plane visiting my father in Saudi, of all things. So I still had an abaya on.
Wow.
And I go and meet my friend, which I mean, for whatever reason, birds of a feather, a lot of us, the ones who really stayed in touch in our early 20s, we all came out to each other. So
I love that.
yeah. So I was visiting him and he's like, we're going to gay night. I'm like, we're going to what? And he's like, yeah. And so we ended up at a house with a couple of his friends because this friend of his, unlike his other male friends, presumably like he knows lesbians. And so I met a couple of queer women who lived in that city. And then we went out to this night, which if you knew who the promoter was, you knew what kind of night it was, kind of thing. My mind was blown. And, I think about that often because I think about how I move through the world and what seems to surround me in other spaces. That wasn't in that space and then the other affinity spaces that we've talked about, right? That's where that stuff is dropped. And I feel like I can interact as a fully seen human off the bat, which has been just really profound for me.
Yeah. And I don't know if your experience of New York was like this, but I don't know. I think there's something about this city that also makes it possible to have all of these spaces and just like move through the city in a way that feels anonymous or that feels like it's not like drawing attention to you.
Yes.
I don't know. I think I talk about how my favorite thing about New York is that you're never the weirdest person in the room.
Yes, 100%. Yes.
Yeah. And I think about that a lot too, the ways in which this city in particular, and like, for me, it's so interesting because New York is now the place that I've lived longest in my life. And it's, the only place that I really feel like I put down roots and I have settled down in after the sort of iterant nature of my childhood and the people that I was around.
Yeah.
But there's something about the moving in ways that feel both anonymous and also settled that lends itself well to different spaces and to building communities. And queerness in particular.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I miss New York for that reason. Our experience there, I think, was probably a little different. And what you just said about being able to move through and not being, how do I say, being unremarkable in certain ways. I loved it and I miss it. So did you have any time in the US before 9/11?
I did not.
Okay, so I think that's the other difference in our experience because I had this 3-year period before 9/11 and then everything started sliding downhill after that.
Were you in college?
I was in college, yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
In my senior year, yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of the book, obviously S2E Butch Blues is a really famous classic work of lesbian, presumably, back then. Queer memoir writing. Is it a memoir?
I think technically it's fiction.
Okay, fiction. Okay. So I'm curious about what your major influences were with the book that you wrote.
I mean, definitely Leslie Feinberg. I think S2E Butch Blues was the first book that I read that I feel like talked about intersecting identities in ways that felt both effortless and also very like deep. Just the way that it talks about race, gender, sexuality, transphobia, and class and labor, and just again like tells the story of this one person, but through this story talks about larger political ramifications of these things. It was just so beautiful, and I feel like it was one of the first books that I read that taught me how to do that in terms of a narrative. So it's definitely a big one. And it's definitely something that I was trying to do in my book too, where, I'm obviously telling these stories from my one life, but I wanted them to speak to something bigger. Other books that I've read or other writers that I've read that have really shaped how I think about the world include Audre Lorde, who I think is just such a phenomenal writer, and just the lyricism and also the truth-telling and the directness of her statements. I can't get over it. I reread Sister Outsider a lot and just find myself moved by it so much. And then I read a lot of queer writers now. I really like Dorothy Allison. I really like Dionne Brand, who's this Canadian author who doesn't get a ton of attention in the US, but is just such a gorgeous writer. Yeah, I'm always interested in people who write about race and write about it in terms of, and don't center whiteness. So Yeah, those are the sort of books that I'm interested in reading and ones that I find myself gravitating to.
I see the public reception of the book, and I'm curious what kind of feedback you've gotten in a more, not personal sense, but more direct sense.
Honestly, it's been really lovely. A lot of people have been writing me just talking about how much the book has resonated with them. And it's not just queer Muslims, but also queer people of faith, just other queer people, straight people. I made the mistake of reading all of the low star reviews on Goodreads, which I know I shouldn't have done. But yeah, it's been really sad to see some of the comments from presumably straight Muslims, especially ones who talk about not having read the book. But again, I know that some of this is to be expected and is par for the course, especially in terms of some of the things that I am saying. But it's also just been really lovely to read feedback from people who are like, I started reading this thinking it would be very different and just found myself moved by it. So that's been really lovely. Yeah, but most of the feedback has been really, really great, and it's felt really, really good, and I've been really pleasantly surprised.
That's great. And then in terms of how you were thinking about audience when you wrote it and where things have ended up, were there any surprises?
When I was writing the book, I knew that I wanted to make it very unapologetically Muslim. And so you'll see that a lot of terms aren't explained. And I've made the conscious decision not to italicize words that were in either Arabic or in Urdu or in other languages.
I really appreciated that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I wanted to not shy away from the Muslimness. And so I'm really, really, really happy that my editor was super supportive about that and just really felt like she was on my side. I wish, I guess, that it was getting more of an audience in terms of Muslims, but who knows, maybe that will still happen.
Yeah. Did you say young people have been reaching out to you?
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah. So I have a couple of curiosities, right? We can take it in one or the other direction. One, what you'd say to a young version of yourself. Or two, just because people are always on their own journeys around sexuality and gender, you talk a little bit about that in the book and not a lot. So I'm curious if I'll phrase the question in terms of how I came to it. Moving to the States, and not because it was the States, but really the moving part, made it much easier for myself when I realized, I am whatever flavor of queer, right? Just having moved from one context to another was, I think, the thing that made it really easy to accept, right? Without taking on the baggage of the place that I was in. It also helped that I was studying the anthropology of sexuality, and that just that little bit of cognitive information, I was like, oh, okay, well, this is some version of normal, so that's fine. I'm going to be fine with it. Can I ask what your process was like?
Yeah. So I think that what you're saying about moving totally resonates with me a lot. Because to me, it also felt a little bit like I could reinvent myself. And if I didn't like this version of myself that emerged, I could move again, So I think there's something freeing about the idea of movement and displacement and this ability to imagine yourself as someone else. And again, we moved a lot when we were kids, just in Middle East, but also from school to school and things like that. And so in some ways, I feel like I knew how to do that. I felt like I knew how to do that. And so I think that the process of having moved definitely gave me a way to explore my queerness, because it felt like I could just move again if things didn't work out. And, for the longest time, I was really scared about telling my brother that I'm queer because he felt like such a permanent tie to who I was.
He's always going to be your brother.
Yeah. And, I just wouldn't be able to cut and run. But there's something about, that constant displacement that is actually lends itself really well to queerness.
I remember being in high school in the Middle East and thinking like, yeah, of course I'm going to get married and have kids when I'm in my early 20s, right? 1 month in an environment where I wasn't surrounded by people who were thinking that, I was like, oh, no.
I love that for you.
Yeah, yeah. So you told your brother he's supportive?
Yeah, he's really, really supportive.
Beautiful. Good, good. Is there anything you want to share about having told him, or about disclosing to not family writ large, but disclosing to supportive people?
I think it always surprises me. First of all, it's really interesting because, the way that coming out is framed in this country is, or like, I guess, like in this context, is that it'll be, you tell people once and then somehow magically everyone knows. But every time I have to do this, it makes me so nervous. And so I was so nervous about telling my brother, even though, I love my brother a lot and I knew that he would be supportive. But I was just so nervous and I just like couldn't find the words and couldn't quite figure out how to do it. But yeah, there was something about telling him that was really lovely. And, my brother is a year and a half younger than me. And so we've always been really, really close. And especially with all the moving and the traveling, like me and my brother were always a team, And so it was really lovely to tell him and be able to share so much more about my life and my worlds, and have him sort of my friends and my community. It was really lovely to sort of let him into that.
Beautiful. Yeah, yeah. I have a couple of particularly wonderful family members about it, and that's
really?
always and that's always really nice. Yeah, beautiful. Well, Lamya, I am so appreciative of you coming on here and sharing your experiences, sharing your book with the world, and taking the time to be with us. Where can people find you and connect with you?
I'm on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is @LamyaIsAngry.
It's a great handle.
Thank you. It definitely encapsulates a lot of my constant rage at the world. Yeah, those are the best ways to connect with me.
And then do you have another project in the works?
I do, but I'm not ready to talk about it yet. But I will say it's set in the Gulf. And
oh, great.
Yeah, and I'm writing about queerness and resistance and the ways that those play out in the place that I grew up.
That is extremely exciting. Wonderful. Well, Lamya, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was really lovely to talk to you.
I've put links to Lamya's socials in the show notes, as well as a link to the publisher where you can buy their book. Also, we had our biggest ever single episode download numbers with our last 2 episodes, Mohammed Mertaban's story. Thanks so much to everybody who listened and spread the word and let people know about us. Please keep it up. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.